My Mac Pro 2019 seems to be at the end of its life. Wait a second, I can upgrade this computer. In the world of Mac Pro 2019s, I have a poverty version. What I mean is, I've spent way less on this machine than a lot of Mac Pro 2019 users have. I bought it new with a lowly 8-core CPU, and over time I added 160GB of RAM and a 6900 XT GPU. About the most impressive thing about it is it has several SSDs in it that were added over time. About the only avenue left for me to upgrade is the CPU.
So in this video, I'm finally doing the upgrade. I paid $275 for a 16-core CPU. It is a quality sample, so it's not a production version. So there might be quirks here. I want to find out if it's worth $275.
Don't worry, I'm not going to torture you with video footage of this quality, but I thought it'd be a totally rad idea if I shot my narration outside during a winter storm advisory on Black Butte in Sisters, Oregon. And using the iPhone 16 Pro's new features, I thought I could remove the background noise. Except for, it didn't work that well. This video will be fairly benchmark heavy, so feel free to skip ahead if that's what interests you. Upgrading the CPU on the Mac Pro 2019 is about as simple as it gets. Step 1. Remove the top 2 hinge screws at the top of the computer. Do not be like me and remove these 2 extra screws on the fan assembly because it's not necessary. Next is to remove the heatsink hood. There's a pair of only 2 screws, so it goes pretty quick. After that, all you need is a T15 Torx screw, except for I found out the one on my screwdriver isn't long enough. It's just a little bit short. Of course, Apple doesn't think this is adequate sized. I went to my iFixit kit since it has extender, but I just could not get enough leverage on it. I tried several times but decided it just wasn't worth the risk. So the next day I went to Home Depot where I was fortunate enough to find extended T15 bits by Milwaukee for about $7, which worked with my trusty Mega Pro screwdriver. This is one of those completely by feel things, but you'll know when it's locked in because it's a Torx bit. In case you ever try this yourself, these are fastened pretty tight, so you'll have to use a bit of muscle to free them. And thus concludes the difficult part. It should go without saying that you need to clean off the CPU heatsink using isopropyl alcohol, preferably with a microfiber cloth. I, of course, did not follow my own best practices and used a shop towel. Don't judge me too hard, I used compressed air to blast off any errant dust particles. Then it's time to swap the CPU, which is pretty brain dead easy. I just never know how much thermal compound I should use, so I tried to err on the side of using too much rather than too little. I give you 100% permission to roast me in the comments section for my thermal pattern. The funniest comment wins. And now for the obligatory montage of me reassembling the computer. Upgrading the CPU on this computer is just such a pleasant experience. It breaks my heart that many hobbyists who would have loved a computer this easy to work on simply couldn't because Apple priced them out. Later in this video, I'll talk about a problem I had with bus speeds, but I know what everyone's here for, so let's get into the benchmarks. There's a secret code among Mac YouTubers, and it's that we're all obligated to use Geekbench 6, so let's start there. The 8-core CPU is a 3.5 GHz CPU, and the 16-core is a 3.2 GHz CPU, and yet the 16-core CPU pulls ahead in single-core performance as well as multi-core. There's 2 key differences here. It has a higher turbo clock frequency, and the W3245M variant has 4 more megabytes of L3 cache. But double the core count doesn't equal double the multi-core scores. I'm going to make this a little more zesty and sprinkle in some Apple Silicon here. I have an M1 Max and an M4 Pro. The M1 Max is about 50% faster in single core and about 10% faster in multi-core. The 12-core M4 Pro is just a different story at 2.5 times as fast as single core and about 80% faster in multi-core. I don't have a regular M4 to test, but according to the Geekbench website, even the M4 Pro in an iPad Pro is faster than this 16-core CPU. And to really drive this home, the iPhone 16 Pro is faster in both multi-core and single-core than the 8-core Mac Pro. So the performance here is at best competitive with a lower-tier Apple Silicon Mac, but that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to Apple Silicon. I'm not really sure where to wedge this in, but Anker sent me this really cool 250-watt charger. I believe the model number is the Anker Prime. This is not a paid promo, and I was not under obligation to talk about it. This is the most impressive charger I've used, as it'll show you how much power each device is drawing. This This thing is beefy enough that it charges both my M1 Max and my M4 Pro at the same time. I debated making a dedicated video, but there wasn't much to say other than I really like this thing. Alright, moving on. Next up is the always popular Cinebench. There's not much of a story here as the Mac Pro 2019 gets a modest CPU bump in performance. Again, the 16-core CPU has the upper hand in single core. Also in the GPU department, we can see the 6900 XT is nearly doubling the performance of a M1 Max 24-core GPU, but the 20-core M4 Pro is outperforming the 6900 XT. I even reran the benchmark on my Mac Pro 2019, and this was the same result, so I'm not sure what's up here. Moving to Luxmark, in OpenCL CPU performance, we see about a 63% uplift in the 8-core CPU. Also for the M Series Max, this is a Rosetta app. It's a dated benchmark, and the Mac Pro 2019 stands tall here. Now for a suite of browser benchmarks using Firefox. The 16-core CPU is faster, but browser benches really reflect single-core performance. Strangely, for the MotionMark benchmark, I could not change the refresh rates in Sequoia on my Apple Silicon Macs, and this benchmark is dependent on refresh rates. Again, it's no surprise that the M-Series Max just run way ahead of the Mac Pro 2019 as Apple Silicon just continues to dominate in browser benchmarks even against PCs. On to Logic Pro. I found this to be a bit underperforming since the last time I ran this test, and maybe it's Sequoia or the version of Logic Pro X, but I was able to play back 186 tracks versus 97 tracks in the Logic Pro benchmark. That's nearly double the performance in a bench designed to mimic the real world. Logic Pro still seems to favor Intel Macs. I made a video comparing the Mac Pro 2013 versus an M1 Mac Mini. Granted, there was a big difference in RAM between the Mac Pro 2013 and the Mac Mini. The Mac Pro 2013 way overperformed. I'm not sure what's really going on here, but the Mac Pro 2013 is playing back more tracks than the 8-core 2019. This could be because I was using older Mac OS and older version of Logic Pro. This is my own wild speculation, but this probably has to do with more physical cores and or hyperthreading making the difference for Logic Pro because it's well suited to harness multi-core performance. In Final Cut Pro, I exported my most recent video, and interestingly, H.264 barely changed, which is likely because H.264 is GPU and T2 accelerated and ProRes 422 is not. In Pixelmator Pro, I did a simple stopwatch test and saw little to no improvement in the two heaviest tests, which are debanding and AI image upscaling. These operations are likely using Core ML, so they're more GPU dependent. When I did the same tests at the same resolutions on a Mac Mini M1 with 8GB of RAM, it was a lot slower. Fornix Test Suite is a great cross-platform command line testing utility, and it has a fair amount of tests. Here's the WebP encoding results. To get this to work on Apple Silicon required a hell of a lot of work. This resulted in a blog post and a pull request. The fix is simple, but it's a complicated problem. While the Mac Pro 2019 comes in spitting distance of the M1 Max, this test really illustrates how much faster the 4th generation Apple Silicon chips are. Next up is code compiling with several different projects. The Eigen, I'm not sure how you say it, C++ library shows the least difference, but the mix of C and C++ code found in the FFmpeg library is nearly half the time after the upgrade. The Node.js compilation benchmark is a bit fibbed because I picked the best score for the 8-core CPU rather than the average, as one run was a lot faster, and it still took twice as long. This is also where the 16-core CPU makes its strongest stand. I particularly like this test because compiling the V8 engine for Node.js is a good stress test as it uses, I think, GDC, Clang, and Xcode. That's quite a bit. Plus, I had to get PyM set up on my M4 Pro as well as Xcode, and probably why you don't see normie YouTubers running these sort of tests as much. Although I can't say I'm Alex the Kind, he benchmarked recently a cluster of M4s. He's cooler than me. The Eigen test only works on Apple Silicon after applying my fix and installing Doxygen via Homebrew. One more thing about compiling before we move on. Dependencies do matter. When I ran the Eigen test using the x86 Homebrew, the time was 3 minutes and 21 seconds.
And now for what I think what a lot of people are looking for, gaming benchmarks.
So let's start off with the obligatory Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark for macOS. This is not an Apple Silicon native game, but accounting for that, the aging 6900 XT is still at the top. At a lower resolution, this game becomes more CPU bound, and the Mac Pro 2019 gets a pretty healthy 20 frames per second boost for the new CPU. The M4 Pro does alright, and I've seen some benchmarks that suggest the 40-core M4 Max can get pretty close to this performance of a high-end desktop GPU that's 4 years old. Since the Mac Pro can run Windows games natively, it's unfair to even compare it against the emulation options like Crossover, which is not an emulator, it's Wine, or GPTK, which is also not an emulator. I don't know why I said that. For the first set of Windows benchmarks, I'm going to start with 3D Mark. I paid all of $4 for this program, and I don't know what constitutes really good numbers. What's interesting is one of the benchmarks, Still Nomad, doesn't show any improvement. For the first time, we see a CPU benchmark where the 16 core is not on top, but it's only for a single thread. But we do see a significant bump in maximum thread performance. In GTA 5, our average frame rates are not that improved. I'm sorry, you only get 4K on this one as I forgot to run 1080p with the old processor installed. The picture though gets more interesting if we look at the minimum frame rates in this game, and we start to see more benefit in the 16 core processor. What this means in GTA 5 you'll see smoother frame rates. In Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1080p with maximum settings, we're looking at about a 3 to 9 frames per second uplift. At 4K, this seems to be so GPU dependent that it's just flip-flopping between which card is faster by a margin of about 2 frames per second. This might sound totally insane, but I'm pretty sure if you stuck the 6900 XT at 4K in Red Dead Redemption in a Mac Pro 5.1, the benchmarks wouldn't be all that much different. I say this because I did this with a 6600 XT in a Mac Pro 5.1, and the results weren't that much different. Now for the final game, Lord of the Rings Shadow of War. Yet again, there's not that much difference here. I do think it's worth commenting on the minimum frames per second discrepancy with the 16-core CPU. Based on what we've seen so far, I would think that this is just a bad run. I know, I should probably update some of the games I benchmarked, but I just haven't bought any games as of late. I just don't play games that much anymore. Getting old.
The Mac Pro 2019 is still the best gaming computer Apple makes, and that's not a compliment. Being able to dual boot is the entire reason why it's great, and having an upgradable GPU. But we're probably getting to the point where the M4 Ultra, when it's released, will outperform the 6900 XT, well, possibly, or be in spitting distance. However, you're just not going to have the game library. Even booting Linux and using wrappers or crossover is just not the same experience.
Sorry, I had to make use of some of that footage. And this is a beer from my favorite brewery that just closed down. That is why you see so much beer behind me, because I bought hundreds of dollars worth of beer because it's delicious. With the Mac Pro 2019, if you upgrade the CPU, you unlock faster bus speeds, and that's true of pretty much every CPU you can stick into that socket, or at least all the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. So upgrading the CPU makes your RAM go from 2666 MHz to 2933 MHz, and the DIMMs that Apple ships with are actually the faster bus speed. Just running the 8-core CPU just means all the RAM gets downclocked if you have 2933 MHz DIMMs. So when I was buying DIMMs, I would buy 2933 MHz DIMMs as they weren't that much more expensive, and I intended to upgrade one day. Except for when I popped in the new CPU, I only got 2666 MHz. And I had to go through every single one of my DIMMs and test them. And it turns out the ones I bought directly from Crucial, one DIMM, and exactly only one DIMM, is faulty and runs at 2666 MHz, despite the label having the faster speed printed on it. So my benchmarks are all with the 2666 MHz bus, and I ordered another stick of RAM. Now for the closing remarks in this video. This is a worthwhile upgrade if you already happen to have a Mac Pro 2019. However, I would not go out and buy one just to invest more money into it, especially with the M4 Mac Minis, as those come in the M4 Pro now, and for $1,500, it'll lap this computer in a lot of tasks. However, the Mac Pro 2019 does have some unique features, the ability to triple boot into many flavors of Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. Apple just limits it by not supporting newer GPUs. Oh man, I had one more thought while working on this video, and that is why I landed on the 16-core CPU. If you look at the Geekbench 6 benchmarks, the 24 and 28 core CPUs are just not that much faster than the 16 core. And in fact, according to some of the Geekbench 6 benchmarks, the 16 core is faster than the 28 core. I don't know if I necessarily believe that. If you were to fire up a huge logic project, I bet that 28 core CPU can handle a hell of a lot more tracks. The biggest factor is the cost. It's about $1,000 for one of the 28 core CPUs. It's just not worth it. As always, I want to thank my Patreons from keeping me from being tempted to use mid-roll ads. Also, again, thanks to Anker, because I really like that charger.
You're not going to get much of a view up here today, but I have the mountain to myself, so that's pretty cool.